lovely war, who wouldn't be a soldier?
So hello and welcome to what I think we're calling the first episode of Oh What a Lovely Podcast, a podcast looking at geeky interests and popular culture which cross over into academic study of the First World War. Is that a non-pithy description of quite where we're going?
That's so catchy.
Sounds about right.
It's not going to win any copywriting awards. So I'm Angus and I'm joined by Jessica Meyer and Chris Kempshaw. So I think we decided this episode we're going to be looking at Star Wars. Now, Chris, this is your specific field.
Yes, I mean, what a field it is.
Yeah, well, I've been toying with Star Wars all week, trying to think of ways that it intersects with the First World War. But I wonder, where would you like to kick us off with? What should we start with?
I mean, in regards to kind of kicking this off, it's also kind of be aware that in the background and kind of out on the internet, I can hear the last 5 people in First World War studies who didn't realise quite how bad I was, just cringing as this episode begins. What I want to begin with, I think, is firstly the kind of the historian disclaimer in that my kind of forthcoming book that I'm looking at examines all kinds of forms of history and politics in the Star Wars universe. And there's always the kind of the temptation not to appear like that workman who only has a hammer and therefore every problem looks like it needs to be hit really hard on the head. So not being like, oh, I'm a First World War historian. Everything is First World War, because it isn't. But despite that, there are recognisable First World War aspects that appear in Star Wars. Now, some of this is kind of aesthetic stuff, which I'll discuss kind of shortly. And other parts are kind of, the difference between something that's inspired by or incorporated into or kind of directly referencing. For the aesthetic and purely the aesthetic stuff, it has to be said that when they were making the original Star Wars trilogy, they really kind of cast a very wide visual net to try and build up whatever it is that they wanted to. So they basically went around scrapyards and old armories and that looking, we need to find a gun. Let's see if we can find a gun. And they ended up with loads of weird and wonderful stuff. But probably the most obvious aesthetic reference is Darth Vader's armor. That is a mix of Second World War German kind of Nazi paraphernalia and First World War trench armor. And I think the trench armor aspect is probably the shoulder and chest piece. It's that kind of shoulder encompassing, and then there would have been the chest armor coming down the body of it. Now, that's a visual thing. It's not like them kind of directly going, oh, we'll put this First World War thing into all the First World War geeks in the audience are going to be, fabulously excited. I mean, I'm a First World War geek and I was fabulously excited, but that's not really the same thing. Where I think they are talking or they are directly referencing First World War stuff is probably in the depiction of body horror and traumatic wounds and the like. So if we take the most recent trilogy, the new ones that were done by J.J. Abrams and Rian Johnson, one of the bad guys who's in it, who gets a variety of screen time in the first 2 episodes, is a guy called Snoke, and he's this kind of big evil guy who's vaguely unpleasant. They model his visual appearance directly off of wounds men suffered during the First World War, particularly across his skull, and the left side of his jaw is kind of shattered and removed. And the actor who plays him, who's Andy Serkis from the Lord of the Rings films, basically points out his deformity is very much based on images from the First World War and from the trenches. The idea that in some way his body has been kind of malformed and deformed and broken, and then there's the suggestion that traumatic experience is what makes him evil, I think is a very interesting kind of understanding of body trauma and wounds and the like. And you see a similar thing in the prequels with Anakin Skywalker as well, particularly in the end of Revenge of the Sith, where he gets his arms and legs chopped off and then gets set on fire. A moment which, when I watched it in the cinema, went, this film's a PG, is it? he's literally on fire when there are children in the audience. This is really horrible. But again, that kind of depiction of extreme violence to the body, acting as a conduit towards coming out the other side as some kind of evil entity, as some kind of malformed. I mean, in the original trilogy, they refer to him as being more machine than man now. you see him being given artificial legs and the like. And I wonder whether or not this is a kind of a process of understanding men who were wounded in the trenches, who were then given prosthesis and the like. And it kind of ties slightly into some of the work of Helen Brooks as well, the depiction of broken men through the theatre as well, which I find quite interesting.
Can I just jump in? Because, of course, this links in with the stuff I do on disability. The point you're making about referring to him as more machine than man, Kate MacDonald wrote an article a couple of years ago now, I can't remember the title, where she thinks she's discovered the first literary depiction of the transhuman, of the bionic man during the First World War, and it is a war story building on some of the myths of, Germans creating, taking their dead and creating a zombie army in soap factories. But actually what this work of fiction does is to create the bionic man as an evil construction using prostheses in exactly that way. Kate's argument is that this actually dates from the war, and it is a wartime trope, the idea of the bionic man as an evil form of post-humanity. So you could probably trace that link fairly directly. But the idea of disfigurement as a symbol of evil, of physical trauma, particularly very visual physical trauma, as symbolic of evil or damage that is non-sympathetic for whatever reason, is quite interesting, because that also ties back to immediate post-war concerns which pop up in the fiction all the time, of war as brutalizing, that war takes men and turns them into something less than men. It makes them brutal, which is somewhat at odds with the more dominant Anglophone narratives of war trauma as a symbol of victimhood, and that trauma makes these men sympathetic in some way. Is there an element of victimhood, that dominating victimhood narrative that appears in Star Wars, or is it just the brutalization narrative, do you think?
It's largely the brutalization. Where you kind of see it in a weird sense is probably through the portrayal of the Jedi in the prequel series. And I'm going to end up having to write a vague amount of kind of pacifism into militarism and weird bits and pieces about that, because they start off the prequels basically being like, we're keepers of the peace, not soldiers. We can't fight wars for you. And then by halfway through the second film, they're all fighting a war. They're all generals, and they all kind of go through a period of kind of peculiar kind of, not necessarily brutalization, but militarization, but in a manner that effectively it's a trick to kind of to kill them all off and to rob them of their purity, effectively. But when it plays out, it's played out in a kind of particularly at the end, in a fairly sympathetic manner, in the idea that these were people who went to war for good reasons, who got caught up in something bigger than themselves. The phrase used to them is that they were deceived by a lie, which sounds very Rudyard Kipling to my ears at times. And they get killed and wiped out and isolated by something that they fundamentally didn't understand. And that, I think, ties in quite interestingly with how at times, again, as you say, in the Anglophone world, we think about those volunteers of 1914 and even the conscripts of 1916 swallowed up in something bigger than themselves that was supposed to be one thing and then fundamentally turned out to be something else.
Well, have you got something with the Jedi as well, sort of backing that up with the fact that the Jedi have a lightsaber? You could almost make a connection with the cavalry, and the lightsabers, it's an out of date weapon. Who takes a, isn't it from, actually it's from another Harrison Ford film, who takes a sword to a gunfight, or his knife to a gunfight?
Yeah, it's an Indiana Jones thing.
It's the Lost Ark or something. Have you got something there as well where they're actually turning up to fight a different war against the evil enemy who've actually got Mauser broom? Oh, actually, no, they've got Lewis guns, haven't they? Yes. These Stormtroopers for.
And actually, in the original trilogy, when the lightsaber is introduced, again in a quite a nice little echo, Alec Guinness as Obi-Wan Kenobi describes it as a sophisticated weapon for a more civilized age, which is very cavalry sword, and that chivalrous aspect of it of, you might have a machine gun, but I have class.
I think that's very much the sort of the masculinity trope of the war, the fiction of the time of the war, of, gentlemen against Huns, essentially, from the British perspective. But equally, you get a German narrative of we are the civilization of Goethe and Beethoven and fighting the crass French and British.
I had another particularly, as you were talking there, Jessica, when you're talking about super soldiers, I wondered if that got us to Stormtroopers and then got us to something like Storm of Steel, where these guys are actually enjoying. I mean, I think Younger, he doesn't he quite enjoy what he's doing, or it's not. It's sort of glorifying what he's writing about. But anyway, this idea of Stormtroopers. Is there something there to be mined? Because again, we have the idea of the Stormtrooper. I'm assuming that's where. Well, my assumption is George Lucas perhaps pinched it off the 1930s Nazi Party stormtroopers. So do we know where he's pinching the phrase stormtrooper, or is it just
a bit of both? Actually, in fact, there's an entire web page about it on the official Star Wars website called "From World War to Star Wars: Stormtroopers," talking about the historical background of the phrase stormtroopers and where they came from in the First World War, and even bits about the Arditi for the Italian army. Because there's no real doubt that when George Lucas is kind of constructing the idea of stormtroopers, he's drawing bits and pieces of the Nazi Party and the kind of the Second World War stormtroopers, but he's also drawing on America and Vietnam. So the word stormtrooper obviously comes from the German army in the First World War, but the kind of the appearance and the actions and even the stuff on that stormtroopers carry around with them. He writes in kind of the notes for the original script and the costume designers that he wants them to have like just weird stuff on their belts that look like they're all serve a purpose, but no one really knows what they are, like American soldiers and the Marines in Vietnam, and like Nazi stormtroopers in the Second World War. So there is kind of an element of that kind of evolution towards an encompassing kind of empowered army, because you end up with the weird kind of contradiction that when you watch the Star Wars films, stormtroopers are useless. they're terrible shots. They fall over. There's a scene in A New Hope which they left in because they hadn't realised, where a stormtrooper walks through a door and hits his head on it and nearly falls over, and it's a goof. But they hadn't realised it when they were filming it, so they left it in. But at the same time, loads of the characters go, "Oh, Imperial stormtroopers are really good shots." Are they? I have seen no evidence of this in about 15 hours.
They always seem to be overwhelmed by about two characters. This was very evident in the last film. I went to see this a couple of weeks ago for my son's birthday. And yeah, the various fight scenes where you're thinking, how many stormtroopers does it take?
Oh, they get mown down completely. Even taking into account the plot armor of the main characters, they could be throwing like beach balls at stormtroopers and they'd all be blowing up. But in the prequels, they start out as clones who are basically a purposely created army, effectively conscripted, who serve no purpose other than to fight. They're bred as soldiers to fight, so they are effectively super soldiers.
I was just wondering, are they also then cannon fodder? Is that that flip side of the eternal manpower crisis of the First World War and the war as mincing machine that they did they reference that to some extent?
Absolutely, and the clones talk about it themselves as being concerned about this, that they're just here to fight and they're just here to die, and it's a war that they didn't choose. It was a war that they were made to fulfill, and therefore what their actual agency is, what's the peace going to look like for them. And eventually, because these clones are all kind of brainwashed to wipe out the Jedi, and that's what they do at the end of Revenge of the Sith. But the in-universe canon is that when the Empire takes over, it stops using clones and starts using conscripts. Instead, just ordinary people drummed up from the planet to serve the Empire. Partly because apparently it's expensive to keep breeding clones. Because, there's always a budget to be balanced. But also, they kind of become, slightly more kind of encompassing and sinister. And by the time you get to the sequel trilogy, it turns out that the First Order, who are the inheritors of what used to be the Empire, are basically just stealing children. They go out and they steal what appears to be young black children and trains them for war as child soldiers.
I was going to say, in some respects, the Stormtroopers almost lack identity. Certainly the first, I'm not sure what we're calling the first three films. Is that...
The prequel trilogy? Or do you mean the original trilogy?
The original first three films.
The original trilogy.
It gets confusing with the numbering. They're all the same. There's no lead character with them. They are ultimate cannon fodder, I guess, as you say, in that respect.
Yeah, and they're designed to be faceless.
Which is interesting, because I've just been reading, the 1970s British Charlie's War comic, and the German opposition in that couldn't be more different. They've have personality stamped all over them, with connections to home, and there's this idea of empathy. And it's interesting that in other pieces of popular fiction, there's often this idea of empathy with the enemy, which you're not getting in Star Wars at all, though, are you? There is no empathy between one side and the other. They're polar opposites.
The only empathy that you then see is from Luke Skywalker towards his father. The idea that despite having done all of these horrible, horrible things, there is still something resembling good inside Darth Vader that can be kind of drawn out to return him to being Anakin Skywalker, which is quite interesting. But yeah, the idea that, there might be some kind of common cause. Oh, we're rebels and they're stormtroopers, but, we're both human beings. We're all fighting the same war. That kind of unifying humanity kind of, Christmas truce moment, it just doesn't appear in Star Wars, really. Certainly not in the films. In some of the books, it starts to appear. The idea that actually the Empire may have been a worthy enemy.
I mean, doesn't it appear in the final trilogy to some extent? Because, and this, I'm not a Star Wars aficionado in any way, shape or form, so I don't know any of the names. But the John Boyega character, who was a stormtrooper and then stops being so, certainly in the final film, there's a moment of empathy between him and another conscript. Spoilers, apologies for anybody who hasn't seen it. Which is about their conscription, which is moving, to some extent moves towards that All Quiet on the Western Front reading of the German war experience, which, for the British public was a hugely important moment when that was published in terms of sort of the wider public seeing, getting beyond an overwhelmingly nationalist view of who the enemy had been. I mean, certainly individual soldiers would have had encountered Germans during the war and expressed empathy for them. But I'm just thinking about this process, thinking through the process by which German soldiers gain humanity in sort of the culture of British understanding of them. Because during the war, they get constructed as the Hun and are faceless in many forms of culture. But then you get All Quiet on the Western Front. And that, I think, for a lot of people who hadn't necessarily had actual encounters with Germans during the war in any way, it allows the broader narrative to change in Britain. And that's why that 1929 war books boom is such a fundamental turning point in the British cultural understanding of the war.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. The example you used from that last film about John Boyega's character and the fellow conscripts, and it turns out there were a number of ex-First Order stormtroopers who all defected because it just didn't feel right to them. They didn't want to be used in this way, that they were human beings beneath the uniforms. Was quite an interesting kind of little snapshot. It's one of the many things of kind of various Star Wars films you kind of, you could have spent an extra 10 minutes on that and it would have been really cool. But I understand that if you did that, the film would be like 20 hours long and it would only appeal to me. One of the weird, interesting aspects of the kind of the construction of the Empire that certainly appeared in what used to be called the expanded universe of the books and the like, before Disney kind of bought the company, had to kind of erase it all so there was actually room for them to tell a story. And it ties in slightly to kind of the end of the First World War, but also the kind of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the breakup of Yugoslavia, is the idea that what happens when the empire falls? What happens next? Is it the end of the war? What happens? The image that they try throughout the books to kind of highlight at various points was that when the empire collapses, what you get is rising kind of planetary nationalist grudge matches against people who had always previously been their enemy, but the Empire had stamped out and kind of created a unified order. And then you kind of start thinking about, the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Civil War, what happens in Germany in kind of 1918 and 1919. This idea that the removal of an overarching empire leads to effectively warlords and civil war and genocide as a kind of a symbol for the aftermath of empire. And they're probably drawing on a variety of kind of parts to kind of draw this image out. But it does appear in the books, this kind of 1918 through 1923, 24, the Greater War idea, by John Horne and the others, that the aftermath of war is war. And genocide and societal breakdown and rising nationalism, which is quite interesting.
I know you've said before in other circumstances, Chris, and a little bit at the end of the previous episode, that the universe of Star Wars is one that draws on a huge range of references across the 20th century. And of course, as a First World War historian, you will see the First World War perhaps more clearly than the other references. But how important do you think it is among these multiple references going on in terms of George Lucas's construction of this universe?
That, I think, is the key question. And honestly, if I'm brutally honest, not that important, actually, to be honest. Depressingly, because again, First World War historian, always looking for First World War things. The overarching, the most important historical event for George Lucas's interaction with Star Wars is the Vietnam War. Absolutely 100% key to his understanding, to the extent that Star Wars isn't even about what everybody thinks it's about. In the popular view of Star Wars is that the Empire is the Soviet Union and the rebels are, plucky democratic nation of group, kind of semi-American, rising up against them. And that's not what George Lucas is trying to portray at all. The evil empire in Star Wars is the United States, and the rebels are the Vietnamese. They're the rebels living on a jungle world, fighting against overwhelming firepower of an empire who's coming to destroy them. And that's the thread that runs all the way through it. And he draws on First World War imagery and Second World War ideas and stuff about, the fall of the Roman Empire and the like. But at its heart, they're Vietnam films. And that's what George Lucas has always kind of constructed in his head, to the extent where I've just been looking through the making of book for Return of the Jedi, and the idea that the Ewoks further embody the Vietnamese fighters against the United States. And when trying to describe the kind of the character of the emperor, one of the producers is asking him, so this guy's an evil, monstrous person, and George Lucas says, no, he's a politician, and his name is Richard M. Nixon, and he becomes bureaucratically powerful and then twisted and then does all of these horrible things to democracy, and it's this core Vietnam War moment lies at the heart of everything. I mean, the film that George Lucas was working on before Star Wars was Apocalypse Now, and he kind of viewed temporarily in his head Star Wars as being a kind of a semi-sequel to American Graffiti, which was one of his first films, which then, it's a coming-of-age story that then gets massively truncated by the outbreak of the Vietnam War. And, I say spoilers. It's like a 50-year-old film, 60-year-old film, American Graffiti. If you haven't watched it yet, I think enough time's gone past that in the credit sequence at the end, you get one of those, and here's what happened to the characters, word moments, and it basically says, several of them went and died in Vietnam. Because the Vietnam War is a massive disrupting moment.
Which leads me to wonder if many of the visual representations are accidentally First World War by the fact that it was made in Britain at the time, because he could get studio space, and so the British set designers go out and get what they can, which just so happens to be, I need a gun. Here's an old German Mauser. Oh, we'll pimp that. I need a big gun. Oh, here's a Lewis gun. But they're British guns. So you get this strange crossover then with stuff that was in circulation in Britain. Yeah,
I think so. Because they want something that looks a little bit military.
I mean, there's also the fact, and Chris, you may know the historiography better than I do, of the American historians who see certainly in terms of the memory of war, the strong parallels between the First World War for Britain and Vietnam for the US. And, Jay Winter makes this argument about the naming on the Vietnam War Memorial versus the naming on First World War memorials, that the cultural impact of these two wars on the imagination of the two populations has a number of parallels. So that when you've got an American director making a film about Vietnam in Britain, the cultural references he has to draw on are not just the physical objects, but the wider culture in which he's working. Will draw out some of those parallels as well.
I absolutely 100% agree with that. And that's almost word for word, I think, suspectingly going to be something that appears in the book. Because the First World War and Vietnam goes so beautifully together in that kind of memorialization, wider cultural memory moment, that you can talk about one using the paraphernalia and some of the touching stones of the other, and they just link up really nicely. And George Lucas can talk about the Vietnam War, and his British producers can talk about the First World War, and they're both basically talking each other's language. It works really nicely together,
which is quite sad in its way. Half a century between the two.
Yes,
and America had to go through it all the cultural trauma. We can discuss the actual trauma of war, but the wider traumatic memory of the war all over again.
You start to see it equally in some of the battle scenes at times. So whenever the good guy rebels are facing some kind of impossible battle that's going to leave massive casualties and it's going to go badly, they all dig trenches. You see it in The Empire Strikes Back, you see it in The Last Jedi, and it devolves into trench warfare. And that's how you know that this isn't a battle that's going to be heroically won. Effectively, it's a holding action or a delaying action. They're going to be casualties, because the whole visualization screams it at you. And then you get the question of, is this something that the directors are doing because they know the audience are going to understand? Or are the directors doing it because it makes narrative sense or visual sense, and they're relying on the fact that enough of it will chime with the audience? It's kind of the direction of travel for cultural resonance.
Yeah, it's interesting about that, because I think I emailed you at some point and said something about talking about the First World War and the final, the most recent film, and you said, there isn't a great deal. And I had this the one point where I woke up sort of 2.5 hours of film and 11-year-old boys was not a good combination. But I did actually sort of sit up and pay attention when there was a cavalry charge. And that was the classic
yes.
Lost cause, desperate hope moment of the film. And yes, they pull out the cavalry, quite literally.
And quite a lot of them immediately get mown down because
exactly. There wasn't any barbed wire, I was sad to see, but still.
That was very disappointing.
It did feel quite knowing, as someone who isn't, deeply into the universe of Star Wars. But then I am a First World War historian, so maybe I was just looking for First World War references.
The other aspect that you sometimes see is that obviously the directors all kind of put in little head tips and homages to some of their favourite films and some of their favourite directors. So in the spin-off film Solo, which is about Han Solo, they have a sequence of him fighting a ground battle, and they thought, well, we want to put him in the most hellish conditions that we can imagine, so let's recreate Paths of Glory. And they do, almost shot for shot. Some of the sequences in that are pure First World War, but pure First World War through the framework and the camera work of Paths of Glory. There are trenches, there's explosions, there's mud, there's horror. It's I forget the name of Colonel Dax by Kirk Douglas. Woody Harrelson plays a semi kind of Colonel Dax figure who kind of can stroll through the carnage without getting hurt. Everyone else is getting blown up in craters, and they have parts where they walk down trenches talking to each other, and it's exactly the same as that really long tracking shot early on in Paths of Glory that just follows Kirk Douglas through the trenches. He's got a chin like an anvil. He's the most testosterone-filled man who ever lived. Then the question, are they making a First World War point, or are they making a Paths of Glory point, or does it not actually matter? Are the two one and the same?
Well, I'm wondering if this is something that's going to come up again and again as we make more of these. Have more discussions about different types of culture and the extent to which can we actually understand the First World War? Can we create any culture which uses the First World War as a theme, which doesn't reference all the cultural reference points in between? And certainly, 1917, a lot of the criticism that point was of that film was, this isn't a film about the First World War, for all that it's supposed to be based on Mendy's grandfather's recollections. This is actually a film about films about the First World War.
And games.
Yes. Yes, and games. Film is a very obvious one. In some ways, it's that it is the medium of memory. It's emerging during the war, and it becomes a really exploratory medium for understanding the war and visualizing it. We're back to your starting point, Chris, right, about the visual imagery. But does that make it almost impossible to make any film about, which references the First World War, which isn't also referencing other films of the First World War? But that's an open question, I suspect. Yeah,
that weight of cultural history and visual history kind of distorting whatever it is you're trying to create in the present.
Well, do you think, as we've sort of gone full circle thinking about where we're coming from, we should perhaps think about leaving it there?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, obviously, we should now extend invitations to George Lucas and Sam Mendes.
Yes.
To come and talk for us. George Lucas is one of the most secretive men in the universe and has sold his company to one of the most litigious companies in the universe, so I can't imagine this will go badly.
Well, he might just come on and then blow everything you've said out the water, or actually confirm you as a genius.
That's true. If it's the former, can we not release that episode before my book comes out?
What are we looking at next? Am I right in saying we were thinking about, is it Georgette Heyer we were thinking about looking at?
We're hoping so. So Vanda Wilcox, who is currently in Paris, has written on Georgette Heyer's historical romances and how they relate to the First World War, and she has sent enthusiastic emails. We need to set a date, but hopefully that's what we'll be discussing next.
Okay, so we'll go and do our homework and buff up.
By do our homework, do you mean go and watch Star Wars again?
Well, from Star Wars to romance fiction, what could go wrong? We're nothing if not eclectic.
It's a lovely jump.
Yes.
All right, thanks everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, the internet.
Oh,